Representative Murphy, would you like to move that House File 194 be before the committee and laid over for possible inclusion in a future division report?
Mr. Chair, I would like to make that motion without the word possible.
You have an amendment to your bill, or do you want to amend the motion? You get one or the other, not both.
I have an amendment to the bill.
All right. Representative Murphy, you're moving the A1 amendment to be before the committee?
Mr. Chair.
All right. This is an author's amendment to get the bill in the order that she prefers. Any discussion to the amendment? Hearing none. All those in favor of the adoption of the A1 amendment, please signify by saying aye. Aye. No. Motion prevails. Representative Murphy, your bill as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate your cooperation on that. I'm before you today, perhaps most unprepared that I've been in many a year to go into details, but some of the information came in later than I anticipated in my preparation calendar. But House File 194 is a possible solution, to make things better for school budgets and addressing the problems that come with present laws on special education and paying for special education. We still have the major problem that the government, the United States government, Department of Education, has never fully funded their share of special education. But we haven't been able to do very much with that. And so we've been working for a couple years on trying to find some better solutions for paying for special education in our public and charter schools in the state of Minnesota. And I had several proposals. I had a $700 million proposal, and I had what I thought was about a $400 million proposal and one lesser. And we picked House File 194 with consultation with Mr. Chair. And I think that this is a concerted effort to address the issue that will make the students across the state have a better education, and the school boards across the state more money in which to have a fair and more equitable education for all children in the state of Minnesota. House File 194 is a comprehensive bill that increases special education, reduces the bill backs, and increases charter school aid. It increases special education funding by approximately $361 million, but we have an updated fiscal note that we will review in a few minutes. And it increases special education excess cost aid, and it removes the cap, the growth cap. We reduce the amount of unreimbursed special education costs that charter schools can bill back to the local school district from 90% to 50%. And the increased state aid to charter schools is equivalent to $420 per pupil that school districts are allowed to levy overall funding for special education. And this increased aid for charter schools totals approximately $127 million per year. calculations are simplified. We remove the pupil, as I said before, we remove the per pupil cap on special education aid, and we increase special education aid by removing the maximum minimum aid limitation and increases the aid from 56 to 62% of the defined costs. We also eliminate the old formula, and we increases, and the 50% still brings in more money than what we had before. Now, we have a run, and Mr. Straub can go over that, and I would like Ms. Emily.
Ms. Adrians?
I would like Emily to go over the fiscal note.
Ms. Adrians, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My apologies. I don't think any of you have the fiscal note. It was just completed this morning. So you will get a copy of it. I'll just quickly mention the front page costs for the bill. The program the changes begin in fiscal year 2021. So that's the first year of costs. And in that first year, it's about $481 million. And then the biennium of 2022 and 2023, the total cost in that biennium is just over $1 billion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Adrians. Mr. Strom, is there a run?
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry I've made a mix-up this morning and sent things to wrong places. If Matt or one of the pages would run to duplicating, there should be copies there in just a moment.
Thank you. All right. Representative Murphy, would it make sense to bring up Ms. Rourke at this time?
Yes.
All right, Ms. Rourke. And members, you should think of the bills that we're doing today as kind of a menu of options. It's certainly not all of the above. It may be A or C or a little bit of B and some of E, and that will be determined through the committee process. But this is a menu of options on the response to the underfunding of special education at this time. Ms. Rourke, welcome to the committee. Thank you for coming down. If you would please state your name for the record and then proceed with your testimony, please.
Cindy Rourke.
Okay.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. My name is Cindy Rourke. I'm a special education teacher at Ordine East Middle School in Duluth. This is my 22nd year teaching in the district, and all my years have been in special education by choice. I also have a license to teach general ed 1 through 6, and I also teach driver education and behind the wheel at East High School in Duluth. At Ordine, I'm one of 6.5 special education teachers. My classroom is a self-contained program with students that have severe and profound cognitive disabilities and/or autism, as well as physical disabilities. My students are so amazing, and I'd like to share with you a few of their very unique needs. 2 students are fed using a feeding tube. 3 students are in a wheelchair and require orthotics to be put on during the day to assist with stretching their muscles and supporting their weak ankles. They are transferred to adapted equipment to help them stand for periods of time during the day to help their bone density so their bones don't become too brittle and break. Those same 3 students require 2 adults to assist them with bathroom duties at least twice a day, often not when they are scheduled. There are also students that don't have the physical needs but need supervision and assistance with small groups or individual functional academics, such as learning community signs to keep them safe in the community, as well as learning their address in case they were ever lost. We work on social skills so they can introduce themselves to someone new that they meet, as well as initiate conversation with peers. A couple of the students use alternate communication devices to communicate. Another student uses an eye gaze system to help her communicate her needs. I also have a couple students that are verbal and able to communicate on their own. All of my students do rely on adults for all activities of daily living, both in and out of school. If an adult were not available, they are not able to have even their basic needs met. My student schedule includes 1 class period each day within the general education class, as well as recess and lunch with their peers. While all this is meaningful and amazing for the general ed students and my students to experience, the reality is we typically miss going to general ed classes at least 3 times per week due to lack of paraprofessional support to transport the students to the classroom. My students don't get outside for recess for the same reason, and we are only able to transport the students to the cafeteria maybe once per week. Their ability to integrate with general ed is extremely limited due to lack of paraprofessional support on a daily basis. I'm only able to make it happen if I have a student absent or if I have a college student volunteering in my classroom. Without that, we don't have the staff to meet the general ed needs that are guided by law, and more importantly, what my students deserve. They deserve to have a teacher available to teach them on a daily basis, as well as support from paraprofessionals that are hired to support their needs, both physically and educationally. I have many years of experience and a solid resume of success as a special education teacher, but I need the support staff to help me so I can offer a program that is able to accomplish the goals and objectives of their IEP. As I said earlier, I chose this profession and I love my kids and my job. I'm here today in support of this bill to help address the special education funding needs so that I and many of my colleagues can continue in this profession and provide these students the support and services they need and deserve. Thank you, Representative Murphy, for offering this bill, and thank you, Chair and committee members, for this opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Ms. Rourke. Representative Murphy, do you have any other testifiers?
No, Mr. Chair.
All right. This is a public hearing. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to testify either before or against House File 194? Good morning, sir. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Hi, my name is Casper Hill. I'm a St. Paul resident. Learning about my daughter was a bit like peeling an onion. There was one layer after another. The first discovery was ADHD. Taking care of that exposed sensory issues, sense and just about noises, just about anything else that in her environment that could shut her down if it became too intense. After that, it was an autism diagnosis. It's high-functioning autism, which is why it wasn't spotted early on. Then, just last summer, she revealed to her mom and me that she's trans. I know that's not a learning disability, but just understand we've had a lot to adjust to. She's now a junior at Venture Academy in Minneapolis. It's a charter school that, among other things, has figured out how to get her learning. Every student's pathway is personalized. So teachers have been able to help her find her own sources of motivation. It wasn't an easy process. As we peeled back her layers when she was younger, we tried to get her conventional schools to adjust her experience there. One school suggested she had a serious personality disorder. A later one provided special ed services, but it amounted to having her leave class when it became challenging and go to a quiet room to play board games. They set a low bar for her, and it cast doubt on her goals of ever going to college. Her test scores were higher than most of her classmates, but she was never considered for advanced classes or pushed to work to her abilities. Those schools equated her differences to deficits and considered them her inability to learn, which they saw as her problem. Her IEPs, her learning plans, were about finding ways to make her adjust to the inflexible school environment. She was bored and frustrated and internalized the low opinions coming from her teachers. She was bullied relentlessly. We complained numerous times about her school's indifference to her torment to little avail. One day she said she'd rather die than go back to school. We had many meetings about it all, but ultimately it was the district that suggested we consider alternative placement. We took a chance by moving her to Venture, and that chance paid off. It was apparent at the first IEP meeting there that the school saw her difficulty learning to be their challenge, not hers. As we peeled back my daughter's many layers, they saw opportunities to change her environment and give her the tools needed to learn. She responded right away, conquering 2 years of math in a matter of weeks. Schools like Venture seek to find ways to teach kids the other schools deemed unteachable. This year, my daughter has A's and B's, including 2 classes she took at Minneapolis College. Mind you, just 4 years earlier, her traditional school special ed teacher casted doubts whether she'd even be able to handle college work. I have nothing against traditional schools. I'm a product of them, and I've done fine. My oldest child went to Southwest High and graduated with an IB diploma. Those schools do a great job educating most kids, but are not batting 1,000. My daughter was one of the times they struck out at the plate. Had there been no charter school option, she would be struggling and college would be less likely. Instead, she's now making a list of her reach schools and visiting campuses. My daughter is one of a handful of middle-class students at Venture. 96% of her classmates are low-income children of color. 1/4 have disabilities. The school is located behind a Papa John's and an abandoned print shop. None of the families enrolled their children there seeking Cadillac services. Most of them don't even know their children's most basic rights. They just know their child was being left behind. They want what I want, a fair shot at a bright future we all dream for our kids. The bill being considered in the legislature will reduce what funding charter schools get for their students, which is already far less than traditional schools get, making their job even more difficult, if not impossible. At the same time, it would reward traditional schools for doing the bare minimum for its special ed students. Please do not approve this proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Good morning. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony, ma'am. That's me talking.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's all right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Erin Wannett. I'm the Executive Director at Indigo Education. In addition, I've been a Director of Special Education for 11 years, and prior to becoming an administrator, I was a special education teacher for students with emotional and behavior disorders. Indigo Education is a nonprofit serving public schools statewide. At this point in time, the entirety of our client base are charter schools. Venture Academy is a client of Indigo Education. Of the 163 charter schools that exist today, we serve 65 of those schools. Although 163 schools may sound like a lot of schools, the community at large really serves 6% of students with disabilities in Minnesota and is responsible for 7% of the costs. During our 20 years of service, we have helped schools to initiate, maintain, and evolve their special education programs. Indigo Education provides guidance and oversight to schools regarding special education finance, dispute resolution, and student-centered programming. Charter schools as a business model are consumer-driven nonprofits. As public schools, charter schools have the same responsibilities as traditional public schools, although access to our funding differs. In short, our programs in charter schools evolve from day to day, depending on enrollment. To reiterate, our charter schools must abide by the same state and federal guidelines in terms of the execution of IDEA, and our agency exists to ensure that that occurs. I think we all in this room can agree that students' needs are growing in their complexity. And as public schools, we have a combined responsibility to address those needs and respond with intentional and student-centered programming. Unfortunately, it seems like there are limits on our financial and human resources at this time. I'm present today to ask you to pause on the forward movement of House File 194. Rather than moving forward with this file, I'd like to propose that stakeholders within the public school sector, intermediates, cooperatives, and charters, and traditional districts gather together to create a formula based on a shared understanding of one another's business model, process for program development and implementation, and the long-term impact thereof. Let's gather together based on our affection for students rather than a competition for resources. I'm hopeful that a byproduct of this work group will be an increased level of cooperation between public schools, which is also most fiscally responsible. I wholeheartedly believe in educators in Minnesota and the administrators in our public schools, and I believe that we can create a reasonable funding solution for public schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wannett? Wannett, can you just explain, I'm not clear what services Indigo Education provides?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, our organization provides Director of Special Education supports. And so if you can imagine that we have about 10 Directors of Special Education employed at Indigo Education. And each district in Minnesota is required to have a Director of Special Education to oversee the program. And so rather than having a full-time Director of Special Education assigned to each charter school, our Directors of Special Education have a caseload of schools, like a special education teacher would have a caseload of children that he or she serves. And so our services are itinerant in terms of visiting and communicating with schools on a regular basis to have program oversight.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Members, you've received both the fiscal note for House File 194 and a run based on House File 194. Ms. Adrians, do you have anything to add now that we've got the fiscal note in front of us?
No, Mr. Chair, I think if you want Mr. Strom to go through the run, that might be more appropriate.
Thank you very much. Mr. Strom, if you could, please.
Mr. Chair, Representative Murphy, and committee members, my apologies for the paperwork mix-up that I made this morning. You've got a run now that was just handed out that's oriented landscape on the page in front of you. It's a district-by-district printout, and what the printout attempts to do is simplify the columns to try and show the current amounts of cross-subsidy, the additional amount of aid that would go out under the special education formula under Representative Murphy's bill. Pardon me. And then lastly, to show the additional aid that Representative Murphy included in her bill for charter schools as a mechanism to essentially keep the funding systems relatively balanced. And let me back up for just a moment here. There's some information in the summary about this as well. But under our current model, special education revenue is essentially a cost-based formula where a percentage of each district's funded through a series of formulas. The cost is not sufficient to cover the full amount of special education. The difference between the cost and the expenditures is what this committee refers to as the cross-subsidy. And if you look in the fourth to the last column, the one that's labeled current, cross-subsidy revenue per ADM, you can see the, or cross-subsidy rather, per ADM. You can see the amount that each district essentially has unfunded of its special education costs. So in that fourth to last column, if you just look at the top of the printout, statewide, $1,056 is the cross-subsidy that's unfunded by the state and federal special education formulas. The next 6 rows list the various groupings of school districts, and you can see the cross-subsidy for each of those types of groups of school districts. And then starting on about a third of the way down the page is the district-by-district run. For those unfunded costs, if a student is open enrolled or is a charter school student, the serving school district bills back to the resident district 90% of the unreimbursed costs. And this is essentially an amount then that goes back to the district of residence. So Representative Murphy's bill really does 3 things. It increases the special education aid, and that's shown in the third from the third from the beginning of the printout column. The change is what's in the black box there. You can see $361 million of additional special education aid will go out under Representative Murphy's proposal. And you can see how those are divided per group. And you can see that on the charter school line, which we'll focus on here, there's a loss to charter schools because the second change for this part of the system, because even though they're picking up a substantial amount of additional special education revenue, they're losing the ability to bill back to the school district, to the resident school district, 40% of those unreimbursed costs. The charter schools would still bill back 50% instead of 90% of the costs. So a couple of points to look at here. If you go just through the special ed change alone, you can see in the fifth to last column that the total statewide, the average district is $412 better off. You can go through the categories of schools there, and then you can see that through this point in time in Representative Murphy's bill, charter schools are on average $390 worse off because of the ability, the lack of the ability to bill that other 40% back to the resident school districts. However, the last two columns show what happens in the first part of Representative Murphy's bill, where she increases the aid to charter schools. And you can see there in the second to last column that charter schools on average would be picking up an extra roughly $2,000 per student because of the two new aids, the local optional revenue and the district's referendum amount where the charter is located specified as state aid for that district. So it won't affect the amount of the question that the taxpayers ask on a referendum, but that amount will be paid to the charter school. So the average charter school picks up $2,000 in aid under that provision. And then the very last column is the net increase in aid for charter schools after the special education changes have been made and after the general education changes have been made. And you can see that the average charter school is quite a bit better off when all of the changes are said and done. So let me focus just for, and I'm sorry to take so long, it's a complicated printout, and I just want members to be able to focus on the right sets of columns. So if you go to the third and fourth last columns for a school district, you can see, just use Aiken as an example, they were having a $916 cross subsidy prior to the change that Representative Murphy's bill proposes. After the change, that cross subsidy would fall to $376 per pupil. So that's the amount that the Aiken School District would then need to take out of pocket, out of its general fund to pay for unfunded special education costs. The Minneapolis School District is the next one down. You can see they have a very large cross subsidy. Currently, they have to take $1,854 per pupil out of their general fund to pay for their unfunded special education costs. This proposal would reduce that by about $700 so that they'd be at the $1,188 level of unfunded cross subsidy. And where you can see these various amounts are in the aid account amount at the beginning, and then through the proposed changes, you can see how those changes help in each of those categories. So in this bill back arrangement, the category in the aid column labeled net tuition, which is the sixth to last category, you can see in Minneapolis that they're picking up essentially an extra $485 of benefit from the way the tuition changes are done, and their total benefit is the $654 per pupil. So on the special education side. If we just take a sample charter schools are listed in the 4,000s. So if you turn to page 9 of the printout, and go to a relatively high-cost bill back on the charter school. If you go to the page 9 of the printout, the third to bottom line is the Cedar Riverside Community Charter School. You can see under that net tuition number right now that essentially the charter school is going to be worse off by $1,925 because they're no longer able to bill back 90%. They're only able to bill back 50%. So when added to the added special education aid, in that total special ed aid column, the fifth to last, they're $1,302 worse off with the special ed change alone. But then if you go across to the new money in general education for charter schools, you can see that they pick up $2,909 through the addition of local optional revenue and state aid equal to the amount of the Minneapolis referendum. So the net result for a district like Cedar Riverside is an increase in funds, not a decrease in funds. That's 1,607 is the net result there. So in summary, Mr. Chair, and I'd be happy to answer specific questions, but in summary, what Representative Murphy's bill is doing is, and you can see this in the fiscal note on a statewide basis, is increasing special education funding by about $360 million, lowering the amount that districts and charter schools can bill each other for the unreimbursed costs, and then for charter schools, providing additional sources of general education revenue to them. And the net of that really is the number that one needs to look at under House File 194. So with that, Mr. Chair, I apologize for the lengthy explanation.
Oh, Mr. Trump, no apology needed. It's a complicated bill with several moving parts. Is there questions from members? Let's start with Mr. Strom and the runs. Representative Hewitt and then Representative Sandell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Strom, just a real quick question. Is this per pupil based on the total pupils or just the ones in special ed?
Mr. Strom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hewitt, the pupils amounts are shown on total pupils using the column called average daily membership. And that column shows up almost in the middle of this printout, right under the T in tuition rate at the header. Average daily membership is the unweighted count of students served at each site. So if we go to your school district, which is 196 on the second page there, you can see in that column that your district has 29,049 pupils in average daily membership. And so that's what all of the per pupil numbers from there to the right are based on, is that count of students. So the change in regular special ed aid for the Rosemont district, District 196, is a $478 increase. The decrease in the excess cost aid, because there's more regular aid, is $67. For a couple of reasons, the tuition doesn't change much for the Apple Valley Rosemont School District. So the net change, the fifth to last column, is that the district's picking up an additional $412 per student, not per special ed student, but per all students in the district in special education funding. And their cross-subsidy then, the amount that they have to pay out of their other budget, would drop from $1,030 to $628 per pupil. So they're just that $412 better off essentially on the cross subsidy. That's all additional money per total student. And you can see that total amount back right by the really dark line. If you go back across, I lost my place here, to the third column, you can see that total change in special education aid for the Rosemont district under this bill would be an increase in special education funding of $11.95 million.
Thank you for your...
A reminder to members, this is only the first of several bills this morning. Representative Sandell.
Just a quick note. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to endorse Ms. Wanick's suggestion that charter schools and the traditional schools get together to talk about the work that may improve the situation for special ed students. That's the intention of the idea of charter schools in the first place, to serve as a experiment and bring back their findings and activities to the traditional schools. Second of all, where does the additional funding come from? The fiscal note suggests that it might come from additional referendum. Is that right? Either Representative Murphy or no, that's not right.
Representative Sandell, I believe the additional funding comes from the Speaker's office.
The target.
Deep pockets. Thank you.
Representative Joachim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just quick, so I make sure that I hear this right, because currently charter schools are not able to tap into the levy referendum. This would allow them to do that.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Strom, can you clarify that for me, please?
Madam Chair, Representative Joachim. Right now, that's correct. Charter schools get neither local optional revenue or the referendum revenue. This provision in Representative Murphy's bill would give them both of those sources of revenue, but all as state aid. So it would leave the question that was asked by the local school district unaffected, and it would leave the property tax unaffected in the local school district. Instead, it would be an additional state aid of that amount paid to the charter school based on the geographic location of the charter school.
Representative Yurkin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's nice to know that the money wouldn't be coming off basically you're holding the levy harmless at the local level. My concern with the way you would measure that or how you would do that, we have school districts that have, some districts that have a really hard time passing a levy, and then some districts whose voters are very generous at passing their levies. So I would be worried about seeing this great influx or shift of charter schools into the districts where, wow, we know that they pass levies really well, and we're looking to relocate. So just a little bit of a concern.
All right, thank you.
Big.
Any other questions from committee members?
You're right, that's nice.
Oh, Representative Richardson? I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Strom, I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the Metro Deaf School allocation under 4005, because that seems like a much higher number than other charter schools would be looking at.
Mr. Strom.
Mr. Chair, Representative Richardson, if members turn to page 9 of their printout, the Metro Deaf School is the second bottom line. I should have mentioned that there are a few charter schools that, instead of under current law billing back 90% of their unreimbursed costs, bill back 100% of their unreimbursed costs. And those are charter schools where more than 70% of the population is students with a disability. And Representative Murphy's bill, House File 194, does not affect the bill back for those students. So as you read across the line there, essentially what's happening is, even though that net tuition is going down, that total special ed number in the fifth to last column, you can see there's essentially zero change for them there. And the increase in general education aid then goes to that district. Now there's some, with a few of the charter schools, there's also a general education bill back to the resident district as well. And so this essentially, I think, would be an entire wash for the school such as Metro Deaf, because even though you're seeing an increase of $1,567 in the general ed column, because they bill back their unreimbursed general ed spending as well, that would be an offset to the amount that's getting billed back in the general ed category. So Representative Murphy's bill shouldn't have any effect on the four charter schools that have more than 70% students with a disability in their enrollment.
Thank you.
Representative Richardson, anything more?
I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Murphy, any closing comments on House File 194?
Mr. Chair, I renew my motion.
So Representative Murphy renews her motion that House File 194, as amended, be laid over for possible inclusion in a future division report. Thank you, Representative Murphy.